Have you ever thought of John Calvin as the virtual founder of America? Hi, I'm Steve Matthews. Thanks for joining me for episode number 5 as we walk through Ecclesiastical Megalomania by Dr. John W. Robbins. Here's the book here that we've been going through over the last several videos. Today we'll be going through the introduction, and the introduction is really the first full-length section of this book. It's really almost a chapter in length, I would say. I'd call it a full chapter. And it contains a lot of very interesting ideas that many people, even people who maybe have been Protestants their entire lives, have never really thought of. One of those is the idea that John Calvin is the virtual founder of America. One of the arguments that John Robbins makes in this is that there's an intimate connection between biblical Protestant doctrine and economic and political liberty. And we don't often see that. It's not something we often explicitly talk about in Protestant circles, and I think that's a big mistake. So let's go through some of what John Robbins has to say here and talk about it. I'd like to start off just reading from the introduction to the very beginning. So let me read it's part of a paragraph here. It won't take very long. In 1904 and 1905, a non-Catholic German sociologist, Max Weber, published an essay that sociologists, economists, and theologians have been arguing about ever since: The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Weber argued that the obvious disparities in the economic development of European and American countries were due in part to their differing theologies. Those countries whose economies had grown most rapidly were Protestant, and those whose economies had lagged behind were Roman Catholic. And he goes on to talk about that this was a very common observation. Max Weber wasn't the first person to recognize this. There are many authors in the 19th century that talked about this very thing. And they look at the Catholic countries of Europe and the Protestant countries of Europe, and they notice there's a big difference economically and socially between the societies to which the Reformation came and the societies to which it did not come. And you can really see the same thing today. I mean, it's not that has changed at all. I mean, just consider the difference, say, between the United States and, say, Central and South America. I mean, the United States is historically, maybe not presently, but historically was a Protestant country. South America, Central America, overwhelmingly Roman Catholic influence. And you see a vast difference in the overall prosperity and liberty of those societies. And again, it's due in large part to the different theologies that control the ideas in those societies. And this is one of the things that, again, that John Robbins talks about here in the introduction. There is an intimate link between these things. Biblical doctrine, sound biblical doctrine, what we would just call Protestantism, and liberty, and also between Roman Catholicism and the lack of liberty, oppression. Max Weber was one of the people that sort of made that, like I say, he had a famous sociological study, and it's interesting people have been arguing about it ever since. I mean, this was written over 100 years ago. It's still a point of controversy. But one of the points, and I think this is very interesting that John Robbins brings out in this chapter, is he said that the problem with Weber isn't that he overemphasized the link between Protestantism and capitalism. His criticism, Robbins' criticism of Weber, is that Weber understated the linkage between those two things. So for what Robbins is saying is that the link between Protestantism, capitalism, liberty is much stronger than what Max Weber even said in his famous essay. And it's interesting, Robbins does, he goes on to talk about a gentleman by the name of Felix Rochefort, who pointed out 6 ways in which Protestantism had fostered the economic growth of Europe. And I thought I'd just read these to you. Number 1, Protestantism permitted the intellect to be devoted to secular pursuits, not just religious. Number 2, Protestantism brought education to the masses. Number 3, Protestantism did not encourage indolence and distaste and disdain for labor as Roman Catholicism did. Number 4, Protestantism championed independence and individual responsibility. Number 5, Protestantism created a higher type of morality. And number 6, Protestantism fostered the separation of church and state. Now that's kind of an interesting one too, because a lot of times, and I don't know, maybe this is the case with you. I know it was with me when I was growing up. When I hear people talk about separation of church and state, it always seemed as if it were the ACLU, and they were always, screaming and berating Christians because, I don't know, somebody put up a cross in a public square or something like this, and then there'd be lawsuits and such like. And I had this idea somehow that the separation of church and state is somehow a bad thing. It's actually a Christian principle. The idea of the separation of church and state is a Christian principle. It's very biblical. And of course, it is enshrined in our Constitution. It talks about the federal government does not have a right to establish a state church, and it doesn't have the right to prohibit the free exercise of religion. Very interesting point that John Robbins makes in this book, and I like the term that he used. I'll just read this here. He says it was not only the spirit of capitalism that was born with the Protestant Reformation, but also the spirit of constitutionalism, the necessary political corollary of laissez-faire capitalism. Constitutional capitalism is a social consequence of the theology of the reformers. That's absolutely key. And John Robbins is absolutely correct to bring that out. I want to read that again here. Constitutional capitalism is a social consequence of the theology of the Reformation. You see, again, and this is one of the points, I believe I made this in one of the earlier videos, I can certainly say growing up, and I think a lot of people, this is probably true of, had this idea that somehow, the Bible was good for learning about Jesus, and you could learn how to be saved. And of course, although all those things are true, right? I mean, I'm not arguing with that. I'm not saying that's wrong. But I had this idea that if you wanted to find out about government, what constitutes good government, or if you wanted to learn about economics, well, you had to go to the real experts. You had to go study the secular academic economists, or I was into reading libertarians for a long time, and that my idea was, like I say, that the Bible didn't have much to say about economics or about politics. Well, that is a gross falsehood, and I think one of the real opportunities that we have as Bible-believing Protestants is to begin to learn for ourselves and to teach others, whether it's our children, whether it's other people at our church, that there's an intimate linkage between biblical faith, belief in the gospel of justification by belief alone, and political and economic freedom. And this is the case here that John Robbins makes. I really like the term that he uses here too. He uses a term, constitutional capitalism. And that really, as he said, it's the social, it's really it's the social consequences of the theology of the Reformation. If you believe the Bible, the logical consequence of that is you're going to believe in limited government, and you're going to believe in free enterprise, private property. Here's an interesting section of the introduction here. Let me read this to you here. It kind of continues this argument. For 1,000 years or more, because the Roman Church states doctrines that salvation was a result of cooperation between the sinner and God, and the saving grace of God was infused into the souls of men, men had been preoccupied, obsessed in many cases, with doing the good works prescribed by the sole dispensers of their salvation, the bishops and priests of the Roman church-state hierarchy. And so one of the things that people would do is, they would spend enormous amounts of time and effort, going on pilgrimages, viewing relics, making gifts to the church, purchasing indulgences and things like this. Well, all of those things do nothing to save one's soul. They do nothing to justify one before an all-holy God. And it's a tremendous waste of money as well. And it was one of the things when Protestantism came along, when people came to recognize that salvation is through faith in Christ alone, and not through doing all of these good works, so-called good works that were prescribed by the Roman Church state. It freed up a tremendous amount of time, energy, and not to mention money to invest in other pursuits. So you didn't have this drain on your resources constantly being sort of flushed down a religious black hole, if you will. So that was a very important development. Another thing too, and I think this is really interesting, and John Robbins wraps this up at the end, and I'd like to talk about this. I'm going to read a little bit here. This is toward the very end of the introduction. It might be expected that an institution such as the Roman church state, ruled by an absolute emperor, structured in the rigid hierarchy, supranational in scope, aristocratic in character, and none of whose officials is elected, an institution in more than one way is an anachronism, an institution of the ancient world, an intrusion of the ancient world into the modern, would not favor constitutional capitalism. But how deep-seated its hostility to freedom and free enterprise was a surprise even to this author. The popes have expressed their hatred not only for Protestantism, a hatred perhaps muted recently, but not by a change of mind, but by the relativism of the church-state influenced by a postmodern culture, but also for the political and economic expression of Christianity, capitalism. So, yeah, he wasn't surprised, John Robbins wasn't, that Rome wouldn't favor constitutional capitalism, but he was surprised. What shocked him was just how deep-seated their hatred was. And you can really see this. And it's one of the things that's interesting is as we go through the book, you can find statement after statement after statement by officials of the Roman church state just expressing their outright hatred for things such as private property. Things that you and I would take for granted. I think even most Roman Catholics would actually be shocked just how hostile their church is to the idea of private property and free enterprise. The popes have warred against this for centuries. And one of the things is too, and this is what happens with a lot of Roman Catholics, and there are Roman Catholics who do believe in the free enterprise system. They do believe in limited government. They do believe in capitalism. And what they try to do is they try to say, well, I accept the theology of Rome, but I'm not required to accept the economics and the politics of Rome. But that's not true. I mean, that is not how Rome offers its system to the public. And I want to read this to you in closing here. In the pages that follow, the readers will find scores of such statements as denouncing capitalism and constitutionalism, scores of such statements from the magisterium of the Roman Church state. They are part of a system of thought that is one of the most impressive systems yet devised by men. They are not disjointed statements, but the logical conclusions of premises accepted in Roman theology. They are offered to the world by the Roman magisterium as part of a package deal. We are not at liberty, as some American Catholics would prefer to do, to accept the church state's theology and reject its economic and political philosophy. That flies in the face not only of the claims of the church state itself, but of reason as well. Now, one of the things, if you're at all familiar with John Robbins' teaching, is he really emphasizes the idea of systematic thought. Okay, so we don't just pick and choose ideas like say you would pick stuff up in a cafeteria. You might take this soup or this salad or a piece of bread or something like this. No, I mean what you get with Rome is you get a package deal. Their theology, their economics, and their politics, they're all part of one system. And of course, it's the same for Protestants. Our theology, our doctrine, say, of salvation, doctrines related to God, these are all things, that are theology. That's the theology of it, but the theology produces a certain politics and economics. So the Protestantism really offers a package deal too. Protestantism, biblical Christianity, that's a system of thought. So we've got two opposing systems of thought. You've got Roman Catholicism as a system, you've got Protestantism as a system. And that's really, I think, one of the big takeaways that you can get from the introduction. And it's interesting, too. I'm just going to read you. This is at the very end of the introduction. And John Robbins says this: "And if there be any Roman Catholic readers who are inclined to favor freedom and free enterprise, may they understand that their church does not, and therefore they must choose to be either good Catholics or good Christians." Thanks for joining me today for episode number 5. I really do appreciate that. I look forward to seeing you again for our next episode. This is Steve Matthews. Thanks for watching. You have a great day.